called herself patient zero of having a reputation completely destroyed worldwide because of the internet. Now, she's focused on educating others and speaking out about public shaming and cyberbullying. She is a producer, social activist, global public speaker, and contributing editor at Vanity Fair. We are thrilled to have her joining us today. The 19th's editor-at-large, Errin Haines, will lead this conversation. Errin?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Emily. And Monica, thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. And if your TED Talk is any indication, I know that our audience is very eager to hear from you, so let's jump right in.
Thanks for having me, Errin. So nice to connect. Hope I deliver. I practiced my TED Talk like 8 million times, so may not be quite as polished today. But
well, let's see what happens. Let's start. As one of the self-described first victims of cyberbullying, I wonder how you think this issue has evolved just in terms of gender over the last decade.
Sadly, I think it's evolved in a way that has been detrimental for all of us, for many of us. What I saw from my own experiences of having my reputation destroyed overnight by the internet, something that happened in a slower process World Wide Web. It was a time where we hadn't really seen that happen, where anybody could make their comments public in a way. And so I think it was the beginning of people starting to see, we have this also with things like, I think it was Blogger, and there was Open Diary maybe. We just started to see this proliferation of, not that I want to diminish everyday people, but non-experts having the same kinds of platforms. It was this beginning experience of, someone who maybe normally for their words to be seen by many people would have to be selected by an editor of a paper or book or something, or to be interviewed. And this process now became, in some ways, which led to great things, a democratization for many people whose voices hadn't been able to be heard. But it also meant that we had this, we had an ability to, it was harder for us to differentiate between what was considered an expert opinion or voice or fact and not. And so what I've sort of seen over the years is that where I'd made this mistake, I was in a public situation because the person I'd made the mistake with was a very public person. I think that by 2010, in seeing with what happened to Tyler Clementi, who had been a private person who hadn't made a mistake, we started to see this kind of viciousness online, going after many people, and in part because it was a big business.
Yeah, no, but it is interesting to kind of start to unpack some of what you're talking about. I think that many people would also argue that you were an original casualty of what we now know as cancel culture, although that was not a term when that happened to you. How do you define or see cancel culture now? And do you think that it's not as bad, the same, or worse than it was 2 decades ago?
I'm sort of in the camp of people who think that, I think that as a collective, we've come to use cancel culture as an umbrella term. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are, both Roxane Gay and Kara Swisher talk about consequence culture and accountability culture. And I think those things are incredibly important. And those are the types of things that we've seen people in power who have not been held accountable before, starting to be held accountable by the sort of democracy of the internet, if you will. But I think that there are these things that happen to private people, and the consequences, the shame and humiliation may be the same for a public and or powerful person as a private, less powerful person, but the consequences and the effects of the consequences outside of an emotional experience may be very different. Some people who in the public eye get canceled and they have enough resources to last them for the rest of their lives. Other people don't. So I think that we need to do a better job as a society right now of figuring out, what are the rules here and what are the consequences, and also what's a road to redemption look like too. I think that we kind of end up in a challenged society when we're just going to punish. I don't know that moves us forward in any way. So.
Yeah. And in terms of how you see, especially cancel culture fitting into this conversation around gender inequality online, right? How much of a role does gender play in who gets canceled and who gets uncanceled?
Right. I think there's an enormous role. And I experienced this personally as a woman who was publicly shamed for, what was considered sexual transgressions or indiscretion. And what it took for me to finally be able to earn an income again was, over a decade. Whereas the other person in this exact same situation, who was the one who should have been more responsible, who had more power, who was older, more life experience, was already making hundreds of millions of dollars within a couple of years. Now, we didn't come into that situation with equal experience either. I mean, so I think that there is obviously something to be said for the life experience you have of becoming president. You're going to have myriad things to share with people, whereas this was my first job out of college, so there wasn't really much else to anchor on. But I think that, so we have seen this for women since time immemorial, that it's women who are shunned and sent away and don't want to be heard from again. Whereas I think we see with men, and in fact, even in the conversations that happen around men who have been publicly, called into account publicly, the discussion starts to center around, well, when can they come back? When have they done enough to come back? Before we're even looking at how do we make the women whole, or how do we make someone from the marginalized group whole if it's from the LGBTQI community. So I just think that's part of the kind of patriarchal lens shaping that we've all been, and depending on your generation, some more than others have been shaped by. But it does happen to women much more. And, we're also, as the same offline, we're at that physical disadvantage, so I was thinking about, with the time change. Now it's like, I like to walk after dinner, but I don't like to walk after dinner in the dark by myself, and I was saying to somebody, I was on the phone and I thought, men are so lucky. Like, that's not even something they would probably think about, in most instances. And
Sure.
So that translates online too. We see with horrific doxing behavior that happens, that for a woman to have your address put out on the internet, and someone to say, I'm going to come and harm you physically, it means something different.
Yeah. And I think you're raising a really important point just about the internet and questions around whose responsibility it is to safeguard privacy for women and young girls online. So I'm wondering what you think about that. Who is that on? Does our government have a role to play? What is it that everyday people who are on the internet should be doing to promote gender equity and safety?
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a role for everybody to play, and I'm kind of often drawn to this analogy around when someone is architecting a new building, that yes, there is the aesthetic to the building, but the first and foremost, most important thing is safety. If your building is not safe for other people to come into, you're not actually allowed to have people come in. And I think that's something we've really lost with the platforms, with the architecture of a social media platform. And so I think that there's a role for social media platforms to play. There's a role for government to play in terms of legislation, in terms of potential changes to Section 230. And I also think there's, then in terms of everyday people, it's, I want to think the best of people, and I see a lot of amazing things, and I think we all see the power, positivity that can happen online.
Mm-hmm.
But it also can feed, I think that social media can also feed into some of our basest instincts, which can be problematic. So what can we do, as people, as I know it sounds a little hokey, but as someone who's experienced online harassment in different ways, it really makes a difference for someone to reach out to the target, because they think, I don't really, like
ascribe to that saying about, you always have to stand up to a bully. I don't think that's right. That's not always safe for everyone. And, but I do think we can all find a role in either making a positive comment, so that we're sort of injecting whatever that feed is of negativity, we're putting some positivity there, or even reaching out to someone privately. Again, I know it sounds like something really small, but it makes an incredible difference when you feel in a strange way, when you're being attacked and you feel unseen for your true self, or you're being, I think, sort of torn apart for things or ways that are not true about yourself. When someone just sees your humanity, it makes a difference. And so that's where a lot of the work that I've done has been, is on trying to help targets, because I think that that's the fastest way we can start to affect change. That's the thing I'm most worried about, is someone who's suffering in silence. And I don't know if you're planning on talking about this later or not. I don't want to, leapfrog your questions, but I just executive produced a documentary on public shaming called 15 Minutes of Shame. And I think actually one of your other interviewees, Dr. Satya Noble, who's unbelievable, an amazing, extraordinary woman, she was in our documentary as well. And in the doc, we talked to not only experts, but we also talked to 4 different people who have had various experiences in being publicly shamed in cancel culture from the internet. And in particular with, the 2 women that we talked to, it is how violent and sexualized the commentary becomes is really something that I think needs to be addressed first.
You are mentioning your own story here, and you talked about the importance of reaching out to the target. I mean, is that something that has happened to you in the past few years, as opposed to in when this initially happened in the 90s? Were
Yes.
you feeling supported in that way? Were you able to find community? Have you been able to find community now online?
So in the late 90s, in 98, when the investigation happened, the support I got was, I experienced more old school. So it was like random people would send me letters, which I very much appreciate. Some of them were clearly not going to be nice, but the ones that were supportive made a difference. And I have experienced that myself online. I think for me, first of all, I've seen extraordinary connections happen of help online. Ways that there was an exchange that happened on one of my threads in my Twitter community where, someone was talking about going through a hard time, and another person had said, I just looked at your profile. You look like a really cool person. Follow me, DM me if you're having trouble. I mean, it's just, we see things like that happen. Or, Sarah Silverman had something happen a few years ago, and somebody was being an asshole to her online. And like, ultimately it was revealed this guy was suffering an enormous back pain, and she, harnessed the power of her Twitter following and got this guy help, So, I mean, these are these micro situations that I've seen happen to other people personally. People will reach out to me that I know or that I have a Twitter friendship with, and just say, sometimes it happens when someone gets pulled, like added into a conversation about me, or they posted something and they'll just remark to me, Jesus, like, I can't fucking believe the kinds of things that people still say 20 years on.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry. And it makes me feel better. So,
Yeah, that was something that was not the evolution of that support, and that support kind of transferring to online now, as opposed to, like you said, those kind of old school letters that you were getting, a generation ago, feels
Right.
very different. But yeah, I mean, obviously, you're making a really good point about kind of the power of connection, the value of strength in numbers for folks. Obviously, the Me Too movement
Sure.
did a lot to kind of show show that dynamic, right?
I mean, Tarana Burke having, done Me Too sort of 1.0 and the 2.0, leading that 2.0 online, I think we see just the far reach of it. and the power of it. And we also saw that too. I mean, kind of following on from that, or along with that, maybe it preceded it. Yeah, preceded the sort of online part of it was the Women's March. You know,
Yes.
the Women's March, it like happening, and the hats. None of that would have been able to happen in that short amount of time with the vast amount of like not resources, but human resources, people who showed up. I don't think that would have been able to happen in that same way without the internet. So, I mean, there are these ways that we, in the documentary, we call it shaming for change too, that it's like the power of the hashtag and the power, what it's meant for people whose voices have normally been marginalized to be able to have a movement online that creates change. I think it's an extraordinary part of the internet, and we need more of that. You know, we need to be finding more of the ways that things that bring us together rather than pulling us apart.
Yeah, and that is really interesting. The power of shame as a force for good, and just the concept of that.
We struggled. You know, it's interesting because we struggled a lot in, you know, as we were making the documentary. It was, you know, we all sort of would come up against these moments where we think, okay, all right, I have a definitive opinion on what they should be and where the lines are, and then something else would happen. You go, oh yeah, no, that just, you know, totally blew apart whatever my argument was. And I think we came to see that you can't just shut down the shaming because it has been effective. But there are ways to look at it differently in terms of, are you shaming an individual, or are you shaming a corporation? Are you shaming someone with power? Or are you shaming someone without power? Do we even have the information? You know, the thing that becomes so challenging about today's world online is we don't know who that person was or what they were doing the moment before something exploded online and they had this tsunami of negativity coming towards them. And we don't get to see people in context. And I think that that's a grave mistake.
Yeah. And to your point, the impact of that, I think for people who don't realize, I mean, you are somebody who can absolutely speak to that.
Yes.
Seriously, talk to people about, you alluded to this earlier when you were saying you were just able to even regain your livelihood in the last decade. What does it mean for somebody to be driven out of public life online in that way, the real life consequences of that for folks who have moved on to the next thing that's happening on the internet,
right?
Folks who can't move on. What is that like?
Yeah. You know, I think it's, you know, when we think about, exactly to your point, when we think about, like, we see a car accident, you know, we're driving by, we all rubberneck. How many of us think 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days later, I wonder if that person's okay? Mm-hmm. We don't, you know, I don't, at least. And for me, it was, you know, I have a friend who every time I see her, she'll sort of, we don't get together in person all that often, even pre-COVID, but she'd say, it's a fucking miracle you're still here. Mm-hmm. You know, and because there were many moments for me where to be a young person, to have lost so much of my identity, to watch my friends all be on normal developmental paths, to not have purpose, and to not have a work that felt like it was meaningful for me and a way to support myself as I was becoming more and more of an adult was incredibly challenging. And I've been very lucky. You know, I was very lucky to come from the family that I did. I was lucky to come from a family with an upper middle class background so that I could get help. You know, I don't know if anybody has I'm sure some people who will watch this have seen the American Crime Story impeachment series. And I think there's a very powerful scene in episode 10 around when Paula Jones poses for Penthouse. And, you know, I came to have such an understanding of these things from what was happening then of, yeah, I was offered millions of dollars too to do that. And I was able to say no. You know, a lot of times women who get caught up in these kinds of scenarios, they're not able to say no. because I was young and had my family who was able to help me, but that's not always the case for everybody. So, I'm sitting here because I've had extraordinary people help me, and I've sought extraordinary help in many ways. And when I do, interviews and any projects, I come up against a lot of my own PTSD, and I do an enormous amount of work to be able to show up. Because it's not easy. Everything that happened. I mean, I'm so incredibly grateful for how things are now, and especially, the positives of online for me that, my younger brother finally had to acknowledge that I'm funny, because people said I'm funny on Twitter. So, that was a great feat for me, but, it's not without its challenges, it's, so I think that my regular therapist is a trauma psychiatrist, and she talks about that the echo and reverberations of trauma, that they, can get softer over time, but they don't actually ever really go away.
Yeah.
And so it's really not about, I'll often complain of like, I'm so sick of this, like, behavior, this traumatic reaction, this patterning I have. And, and she'll just remind me it may not go away. I just may get better at catching it faster, recovering from it faster. And I think that those are important things for all of us to understand,
Yeah.
So, and that we can get support from that online too. So, but particularly women. So,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, and I think you being able to find your purpose, obviously the world has changed not nearly enough for us to be able to see your story in a new light, in light of the way that our society hopefully is beginning to evolve on a lot of these issues, but also just that your story is not over, right? That you are able to have purpose, that you are able to find a career, for people to find out that you are funny, to find out about your personality online. I mean, I think that is fascinating, and really a testament to the triumph of the human spirit for you, and that is a result of the work that you have done and are continuing to do. And so I just think that is really remarkable. You talked about the work that you're doing now. I want to get more into that. Talk about what being an anti-bullying activist looks like for you.
It's been a very evolving journey for me, because when I everything for me is sort of like ADBC is basically my Vanity Fair first person essay in 2014.
Yes.
So that's really where things started to change for me. But prior to that, I had wanted to volunteer in an organization that does artwork with kids while their parents are in the justice. It's like a much more complicated thing, and I felt really connected to the idea of trying to do that. And to make a long story short, I wasn't allowed to. So my concern around stepping into any sort of not philanthropic, but activism, really. I was concerned people wouldn't let me do it, that I wouldn't be welcomed. And there were a couple voices in the beginning, but there were enough voices that saw that I could bring some value to the landscape and of what we're all trying to do. And where I sit is I consider myself really lucky, because I don't have my own organization. It's meant I've been able to be involved with many anti-bullying organizations and trying to help affect change or amplify their messaging, rather than me needing to be a person out there. And then the pre-COVID and this year, because this fall was crazy for me.
Sure.
About the last 3 years, I teamed up with BBDO New York to do PSA campaigns for Anti-Bullying Month. And so we looked at our online versus offline behavior. We looked at name calling. We looked at the social epidemic of how easily the signs can be hidden of, of when a young person is experiencing bullying and what to do. So for me, I think that, I'm in a place of I'm starting to try to build another career as well. So I'm just trying to find where does my time go? How do I continue to support other organizations and to help in any way I can, while also doing, a different kind of storytelling. So
Yeah. Well, speaking of storytelling, I certainly was among the many, many people around the country, around the world, who watched American Crime Story and was really able to revisit that period in our country's history and just rethink so much about that time. I wonder what your experience and especially having that series air, reflecting on that yourself, what has this all taught you about the power of owning your narrative, both on and offline?
I think the lesson for me started really with one of my professors from graduate school, Dr. Sandra Jovtelevich, and she and I had a coffee after I'd graduated, and it was in that period where I was still trying to find purpose, and she had said to me that part of the problem was that there was no competing narrative out there, that my narrative had run away from me, and that it had been taken by the people in power. And the only way to shift that is to present a competing narrative. I was not ready to hear that when she told me that. And it took me several years of that kind of marinating in the background. But I think what is incredibly important is as often as we can to be defining ourselves in our own words. I was very lucky to be able to write a first-person essay for Vanity Fair rather than it being an interview. And, I know we don't always get those opportunities, but I think that's what made an enormous difference at the time, was to be able to present yourself unvarnished or in the way that you want versus being mediated through someone else's lens, I think is really important. And, with the show, it was, there were so many difficult moments, but what I never had to experience, which I had experienced in other ways before, thankfully, I didn't have to experience it this time, was just this panic of, like, essentially, what are they going to do to me now? Mm-hmm. And I didn't have to have that because I was involved in the process, and I didn't have approval. There are a lot of things that I'm very proud of the series as a producer, as a subject. There were, some things in there that I wish had been a little different, but, it's, but I'm not really sure at the end of the day, everybody would have been doing their job if I had been thrilled with everything. So, because I am a human being. But, I think that, in that way, I hope that as a result of this series, more and more people are able to be involved in these kinds of stories. That it's not just taking something from someone, but getting their permission, getting their involvement, and I think we are seeing more of that. That it's I think both with Shonda Rhimes' series that's coming out. I don't know what they've called it, but I think we see it with it's the Anna Delvey story, mm-hmm. right? So Shonda's doing that. I think that the journalist who wrote the article was involved in that story, mm-hmm. And being the Ricardos, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz's kids are involved as producers. Mm-hmm. And I think that says something. I think that that's a very, I think that's important for us in understanding narratives that they're not something. Okay, I'm going to sort of shift directions in a way. We see it in a different way with paparazzi photos. And this idea of sort of a First Amendment expression where you can just go and take something from someone without their permission and make money on it. You know, and I think that, you know, I think that there's sort of, this is all part of a bigger conversation around acknowledgement and appreciation. And we see it in, you know, this extreme of narratives, not extreme, but from narratives to, you know, cultural appropriation. You know, I think that it's about, I think that we're trying to stretch around in our boundaries with all of these things. So.
Yeah, but that's so interesting. Just the idea of not about me without me. And how that really shifts what the conversation with the narrative can be. Well, the last thing I want to ask you really is, you know, if you have a message for anyone who is, you know, feeling vulnerable or is being attacked online, what is your message to those folks? What do you want them to hear from you in this moment?
Please don't suffer in silence. Please don't suffer in silence. There is no shame in, I think especially younger people can sometimes feel shame when they're the target of something happening. So please don't suffer in silence. Reach out to someone who's trusted or friend. If it is really bad, there are, you know, crisis text line or the Trevor Project hotlines to reach out to. I think that that's incredibly important. And there's an or if you're having severe harassment, there's an organization called Heart Mob that will help people harness, kind of be the ones to provide support. But I think really it is, it's to not suffer in silence, because that's I think when the most damage happens and the worst consequences are possible. So.
Yeah. Well, we will end it on that note. Monica, thank you so
much
for
participating
in this conversation. We the 19th really joined you in calling for a more equitable society, both digitally and in the real world. So thank you.
Well, thank you for all the amazing work you're doing and with the 19th and the 19th. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica and Errin, for that delightful and inspiring conversation. Every day, people use apps and platforms that are built on algorithms